Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Archives. My name is Michael Hussey, and I'm going to do some brief introductory remarks, and then we'll get started with the program. So welcome again to the William McGowan Theater, and today's book discussion, The Marriage Heard Round the World, America's First Gay Marriage, with our speakers, Michael McConnell and Jack Baker. Welcome also to those watching us on the National Archives YouTube channel. And before we get started today, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about two upcoming programs that will take place in the theater and also on our YouTube channel. On Tuesday, October 11th at noon, author Stephen Puleo will be here to discuss and sign his recent book, American Treasures, The Secret Efforts to Save the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Gettysburg Address. Puleo charts the little-known journeys of these documents, crafting a sweeping history of a nation united to preserve its definition of democracy. On Thursday, October 13th at noon, we will screen a new historical documentary film, The Year of the Tiger, JFK, 1962, which features archival images, film footage, and audio recordings from the National Archives and other sources to chronicle the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Following the screening, director Joe Luby will discuss the film and answer audience questions. To learn about these and other public programs and exhibits, please consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online at archives.gov. There are also copies in the lobby, along with sign-up sheets so that you can receive it by regular mail or email. And you'll also find brochures about National Archives programs and activities. One other way to get involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the agency, especially its education and outreach programs such as this. You can pick up an application for membership in the lobby or become a member online at archivesfoundation.org. Okay, now I have the great honor to introduce Michael McConnell and Jack Baker, who I just had a wonderful chat with back in the green room. Our guests today, again, Michael and Jack, were at the forefront of many of the struggles for LGBT civil equality, marriage rights, employment non-discrimination, equal treatment for those serving in the military or those who are veterans who had served in the military, community centers, all sorts of things that you can hear about from their talk and in their book. But I want to just give you a few highlights. In 1970, they unsuccessfully applied for a marriage license in Hennepin County in Minnesota. They then took their case to the courts, ending up at the US Supreme Court in a case titled Baker v. Nelson. The Supreme Court ruled against them in 1972. In 2015, however, the Supreme Court specifically overturned that 1972 Baker v. Nelson decision in the Obergefell marriage equality case. Also in 1970, a busy year for these two gentlemen, Michael McConnell was denied a job with the University of Minnesota Library System because he's gay, and also because some of the publicity around their application for a marriage license. He sued the university in a case called McConnell v. Anderson, but was denied by the U.S. Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court decided not to hear the case any further. However, this was part of a growing number of employment discrimination cases that were starting to gather in the federal court system. In 1976, Baker and McConnell sued the Veterans Administration in federal court. This is McConnell and Baker v. Morris Nooner et al. For military benefits offered to married service members with dependent spouses, but that were denied to them. I'm happy to say that their pioneering efforts are part of this nation's permanent historical record as part of the National Archives collection of over 13 billion documents. Their work will forever be one of the many thousands of American stories preserved here and at our facilities across the country. Samples of documents related to their work, their lawsuits in particular, and many other LGBTQ-related topics are now available on a Tumblr account, which Stonewall at NARA, the LGBTQ employee affinity group of which I'm president, has created, and that's available at lgbtqarchives.tumblr.com. Many of the cases that I just cited will also be available in the National Archives online catalog in full. After their talk, Michael and Jack will be taking questions. There are microphones at either side of the room, if you would please use those. They'll also be signing copies of their book, One Level Up, in front of the Archives store. Now, enough of me, and please help me welcome Michael McConnell and Jack Baker.
Since I'm the most talkative of the two of us, I'm the one that's going to be doing most of the talking during this presentation. So bear with me on that, but Jack gets his turn too. Today, Jack and I are here to speak with you about our new memoir, The Wedding Heard Round the World, America's First Gay Marriage. We also want to tell you a bit about our personal history. To give you a taste of the memoir, which I see as much a love story as it is a legal story, I want to begin by reading the prologue to the book. Jack finishes dinner first and lays his folded napkin on the solid surface of our round oak table. How many times have I seen him do this? This man, my husband for more than 40 years, hasn't changed much since the young man I met when I was a college student at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma in the 1960s. I know that everyone sees themselves at the center of their own stage, and every couple feels like they are creating their own universe. But for us, getting married really did set off tremors that ripped through the solid surface of our culture. After our union was announced, we received thousands of letters from around the United States, from Canada and Mexico, from Chile, Argentina, Norway, Israel, and India. The letter writers hailed our wedding as both a model for action and an inspiration for dreams. Of course, we didn't think of ourselves that way. We were young and in love. We were announcing who we were, pledging to love and honor each other, to uphold our commitment through sickness and health. But we did understand that we were jump-starting society's change by tossing a monkey wrench into an antiquated system. Then we stood back, our arms around each other, and waited as the system struggled to reboot. My husband is Jack Baker. He became the darling of the national media in 1970, the year he was elected the first openly gay student body president. My name is Michael McConnell. Ours is the world's first gay marriage. Today, Jack and I are here to speak with you about our new memoir, The Wedding Heard Round the World, America's First Gay Marriage. Yes. We also want to tell you a bit about our personal history, to give you a taste of the memoir. Now I want to tell you a little bit about my personal family history and background. This experience set the tone for my decision to live openly as a gay man at a time when many could not. When Jack and I committed in 1967, Jack was a practicing engineer and was working on his master's in business administration. He eventually got his law degree because of his promise to me and his commitment to gay rights. Over the years, he took on the military and won. He ran as an openly gay candidate for student body president of a student body of over 43,000 students and won not once but twice, He helped establish one of the first gay student organizations on an American campus. And he also ran for city council in the city of Minneapolis and for the Minnesota Supreme Court. But now Jack wants to tell you a little bit about his history. So let me have him do that.
I grew up in, well, when I was 3 and 4 years old, my mother died when I was 3 and my father died when I was 4. And as a result, I ended up in a boarding school that was run by the Catholic Church and funded by the county. That was in Chicago, just outside of Chicago. At this boarding school, there were 500 homeless boys and 350 homeless girls. It made me wonder, and that was just the Catholic Church, and I assumed that there were an equal number of homeless children run by other religions like the Methodists and the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the other religions. So it made me wonder as a child why there were so many homeless children in and around Chicago. But at 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, you don't ask questions like that. You just simply live your own life and try to get along with everybody. So I graduated. I spent 11 years and 9 months there at the name of the school was Maryville Academy. I spent the 11 years, 9 months. I graduated from high school at the age of 17, and then went on to the Illinois. I enrolled in the Illinois Institute of Technology. I was not dissatisfied with the IIT, but some of my peers were, and they wanted to go and travel to Arizona. And so rather than be left alone by myself at IIT without my friends, I decided to go with them. And there I spent a year at the University of Arizona, and there they have a mandatory, at the University of Arizona at the time, they had a mandatory requirement for students to go into, have the enrolled in ROTC. A lot of students didn't like that, and they didn't take it seriously. I decided that as long as I'm here, I might as well take it seriously, and so the instructor, who was a officer, decided to recommend me for to be they said that if I would enroll in the Air Force and agree to take an additional 2 years of commitment with the Air Force, that the Air Force would send me back to the same place from which I left, which would be the University of Arizona, and they would pay full scholarship and pay all the tuition and all the bills and everything while I was serving in the Air Force. I decided to take them up on that and join the Officer Education Commissioning Program. As generally happens in the military, documents get lost, and so on the way to training for the Air Force, the documents got lost, and as a result, it was a year or so before I finally got enrolled and transferred, and I was sent to the University of Oklahoma, and there's where I finished my engineering degree, and then went to take on the active duty. And at that point, the Air Force decided to renege on its commitment and decided that it would not give me the officer commission that had been promised in exchange for the 2 additional years. And so I said that, well, if you're not going to keep your promise, then there's no reason why I have to keep my promise. And I was really surprised that they said that's fine, and they issued an order of discharge. And on the way out, I was given a Air Force an airplane ticket back to Norman, Oklahoma, and an honorable discharge. Later, after I was out for a year or so, out of the blue, the Air Force just decided to change the honorable discharge to a general discharge for no conceivable reason. Just in the mail, I got a letter saying, we're going to change your discharge certificate, and they issued me a new one. And I decided that there's no way I'm going to accept that. And that's when I applied to the American Civil Liberties Union of Washington and asked them to represent me with the Air Force to get the discharge certificate reinstated. And to make a long story short, after a year or two and a lot of arguing with them, they finally agreed to do that. And so that essentially got me on the trail of wanting to be take it then off and not accept anything from people who were going to treat us unequally. And that's when I went back to the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. That's where Mike and I met, and Mike can talk more about that.
When Jack returned to Oklahoma, by this time, I had been an out gay man for a number of years. And my family I was one of those fortunate people who never grew up with guilt, shame, or hid or lied about who I was. And my family, after a very short initial period of really, we had no idea, which I found rather amusing since I did not consider myself to be the butchest guy in the world. But nonetheless, my family was very loving and very protective. I lived in a cocoon in the middle of the Bible Belt with the First Baptist minister living 2 doors down from my parents. And at the same time, I felt like I could be who I was and felt confident about myself. So by the time I was in college and had met Jack, I had already kind of been around the block. So with my family, it was, you don't mess with Michael, because if you mess with Michael, you mess with our family. If you mess with our family, you're in for a world of trouble. And that's the kind of environment that I grew up in and felt most comfortable in. And by the time Jack came back from the Air Force, I was pretty much ready to move into a long-term relationship and something that I could commit to. I had my dreams for the future and what I saw as something really, really important. So, today we look back at the history of marriage equality with the certainty of success. In 2020 hindsight, we can be sure that same-sex marriage has prevailed. From Massachusetts in 2004 to the Supreme Court ruling in June of 2015, the Wikipedia version of history is that marriage equality swept the land with a speed seldom seen in social justice movements. That is certainly an exciting and hard-won part of the story. But the full story, the archival story, our story, of the beginning of the public fight for marriage equality is one you may not know. Just a quick step back to add some context. We were in our 20s, living in small towns outside of Norman, Oklahoma, when we met. Our story together began when a friend introduced us at a party in 1966. Cruz Sanchez was his name, told me, "Trust me, you two are destined for each other." I rolled my eyes and thought, he's at it again. He's trying to fix me up. Eventually, after dating for 6 months, Jack suggested we move in together. When Jack proposed, I was delighted that the man I adored wanted to make a commitment to me. I happily accepted Jack's proposal, but on one condition. I told him that all the McConnell kids have been raised by Mom and Dad to believe that we are as good as anybody else. Any man who wanted to spend his life with me must accept that as well. So I agreed to be Jack's lover, but he had to agree to marry me fully, legally, in every sense of that word. Jack was naturally surprised. Who'd ever heard in 1967 of gay men having a legal marriage? But he was also intrigued. Jack's reply, well, looks like I'm going to be going to law school. That night, he decided to apply for law school to see how he could make my dream come true. That's when Jack and I began our journey as marriage equality advocates. To appreciate the groundbreaking context of our story, it's important to remember the world as it was in 1967. In some ways, and in some places in this country, that world still exists even today. But in 1967, homosexuality was a mental illness. Sodomy was a criminal act in 49 states, and it was legal to discriminate against homosexuals in employment, housing, accommodations, and any other way you could imagine. In short, you could be evicted, fired, arrested, jailed, declared mentally ill, and institutionalized for just loving someone of the same gender. Many lived in fear. Many lived in shame and guilt about who they were and who they loved. And yet, somehow Jack and I dared to dream of marriage, of full and absolute equality. After we both graduated with our master's degrees, we moved to Lawrence, Kansas. That was halfway between our two jobs. Jack's with DuPont Corporation just outside Topeka, Kansas. Mine at a private college in suburban Kansas City to the east. A little over a year later, by 1970, Jack was a first-year law student at the University of Minnesota. He was also active in FREE, which was a student organization for gay students. He had become its president. I was finishing out the second year of my 2-year contract as a librarian in Park College in Kansas City and looking for a job in Minnesota. During that year of separation, our letters were the exchanges of any lovers. I would send Jack multiple-page letters about my hopes, my fears, and my feelings. Jack would reply with short postcards. I miss you. I love you. Don't forget to renew the car tabs. During that year of separation, our letters were exchanges of any lovers. Jack would send multiple-page. Jack wrote a longer letter a little later about his experience of separation from me. I want to read a little bit from that. The more I thought about you and our relationship, the more I realized how society had kept me from really enjoying life by forcing a double life on me. It was because of you that I decided to unmask completely and demand respect. I haven't regretted that decision, but instead have found a different type of happiness in finding real friends and just generally. It gives me tremendous pleasure to talk about my lover in front of straight people and see them listen attentively. It's as though I've seen the sky for the first time. He closed the letter writing, "Someday I promise we'll be together again." That spring, I received a job offer from the University of Minnesota Libraries, and Jack and I planned for our reunification in Minneapolis. During his first year, when Jack was a freshman law student at the University of Minnesota, he learned in his legal research class that Minnesota statutes on marriage at that particular point in time did not include language specifying gender. So on May 18, 1970, just before I was to begin my job at the University of Minnesota, Jack and I put on suits and ties and went to the courthouse in downtown Minneapolis to request a marriage license. We made history when we became the first gay same-sex couple in the United States to apply for a marriage license. That act changed the course of history. We continued to make history and headlines when, despite setbacks in the courts, we changed history again. That was in 1971, when we became the first same-sex couple to be legally married under a license we received in Blue Earth County, Minnesota. That was from Mankato, which is a city 60 miles south of Minneapolis. On September 3rd, 1971, with that Blue Earth County license in hand, we were married by the Reverend Roger Lynn of the United Methodist Church. He continues to call us one of his most successful marriages. That was 44 years before the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell versus Hodges that in 2015 that same-sex marriage is a fundamental right. Incidentally, that 2015 ruling contained a sentence that referred to Baker versus Nelson, the first application that we made in Hennepin County, and Jack had taken all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in '72. Our application became world news. Among those who heard were the members of the Board of Regents. And at an act that was unprecedented, the board rescinded its job offer to me. When word of our marriage application went public, and the boards had rescinded that job offer, I enlisted the help of the Minnesota Civil Liberties Union and appealed the Regents' action in a case called Baker versus Anderson, which went to the U.S. Supreme Court. That meant we now had two cases on their way to the U.S. Supreme Court, our marriage application and my job discrimination case. Although it was a clear instance of job discrimination, the High Court refused to hear the case from the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, and I was left with no alternative but to start my career again. 3 years later, I accepted an entry-level job with a public library system, and 37 years later after that, I retired as an administrator from the Hennepin County Library System, which eventually became one of the top library systems in this country. To continue, the lawsuits on the denial of the marriage license application in Hennepin County and the withdrawal of the job offer generated even more publicity. The license we obtained in Mankato, which was granted before officials realized who we were and that we were two men, stirred the flames still more. Jack and I were in Look, Life, and Time magazines. We were covered in local and national newspapers and featured regularly on TV and radio. We appeared on the national TV talk shows of the time, Phil Donahue Show, David Susskind Show, and Kennedy and Company in Chicago. This visibility engendered more letters from around the world and came from the UK, Barbados, Chile, Argentina, Australia, and many other countries. The letters, now more than 45 years old, document the hope and despair, the anger, the determination of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. That makes the letter what makes the letter so remarkable is that they provide a window into the lives of people whose very survival depended on being hidden during those times. But at this moment, they spoke for themselves. There were letters of support, sometimes with $1 or $2 enclosed to help us with legal costs. Dozens of letters sought advice, including one from two lesbians who lived in St. Louis who were 19 and 20 years old. They wrote, "If we did go through with the ceremony, would it entitle her to use my last name? We read about you and Mike in Look magazine. It made us feel proud because it's the first time we've seen anything about homosexuals printed in a national magazine. I believe it's time for the public to accept us." Another from Tennessee wrote, "May I please extend to you each my profound congratulations upon your recent matrimony and convey my deepest felicitations and on a productive and pleasant life together. I am a homosexual who lives in agony, turmoil, and fear every moment of my existence. This is simply because no one has entered my bleak life as the two of you found happiness in each other, maybe one day my need for steady human companionship and compassion shall be answered. Then there was a quite unique letter of 44 pages, handwritten. This was from someone who was serving in the Marines during the Vietnam War. This last subject I'm going to cover has been on my mind for about 4 or 5 years now. It's something that has really held my interest. It's daring, yet so exciting. It's the subject of me becoming a female, a transsexual. I understand that it can prove to be fatal, but sometimes, well, most of the time, I feel that even living as a real woman for 5 years would be almost worth it. I could literally keep you here for a week reading letters that we received. I remember when I was putting these together for the archives, Jack came downstairs and said, "What are you blubbering about?" I was sitting there sobbing and blubbering, and not seeing these letters for 40 years, I was transported back to those times, and it reminded me of the pain that so many people endured because of who they loved. It was so powerful to see those letters. But I'm not going to do that, but I am going to say Jack had a letter from a young gay activist that I do want to read you because for us it embodied hope. I'm glad you're trying to form a gay liberation group. As you can see, it's a lot of hard work, but it's fun and very satisfying knowing you're helping to end the senseless oppression of gay people. I hate to say this, but as you have found out, sometimes those who will oppose you the most will be gay people themselves. I explain it away as a fear of the, quote, heterosexual backlash. A lot of gay people have written to us saying we should just be quiet and live by ourselves and not make much of a big deal of things. I say that if we continue to create publicity, that will be an excuse for the police or others to start a campaign of open oppression. Unfortunately, I don't believe that, and I must act according to what I consider to be the betterment of everyone. The times they are changing. We're in the midst of a serious social revolution. Welcome aboard. The times have indeed changed, in large part due to the courage and vision of those who stood tall for full equality, and the hundreds of people who wrote letters to us expressing their dreams to find a way out of the darkness. We always believed the right to marry was inevitable. The arguments we made first in 1970 are the very arguments that prevailed in 2015 before the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, with that brief history I presented here, what I'd like to do is ask Jack to talk again. I'd like for him to talk a little bit about the complicated legal battles and the strategy surrounding how we got here.
When the clerk of court of Hennepin County refused to issue a license, I found an article in one of the local papers in which he openly bragged that there's no way, even though, regardless of what the statute said, he wasn't going to issue a marriage license. And so we had to take him into the local district court, and then the local district court upheld what he had done, even though it was perfectly legal. The statute did allow it. One of the things, and the reason I know that is that one of the first course that you're required to take in law school is legal research. And so after I finished that course, I decided to find out if I actually learned anything. So I went to the law library and read the opinion for the marriage statute, and found that I couldn't see anywhere in it that it mentioned persons of the same sex. Pardon?
Opposite sex.
Opposite sex. Well, yeah, it mentioned only persons. It just simply mentioned that the two parties. And one of the other courses that I learned in law school said that what's not forbidden is permitted under our Constitution. And so if it's not that citizens have all of the rights to be themselves unless it's forbidden by statute. And so if it's not forbidden, the statute did not forbid two persons of the same sex to be married, then it is permitted under what I had just learned in one of my courses. And there was another course that was talked about the equal protection under law, that all citizens are entitled to equal protection under law. So when you put all of that together, I drew the correct conclusion, as it turns out, that that we have a constitutional right to get married, to get a marriage license. But the clerk of court decided against that, and he didn't care what the statute said. He wasn't going to issue it. We took that into the district court, and the district court upheld that. And ultimately, we appealed to the Minnesota Supreme Court, which also upheld it by simply saying that our way is as old as the book of Genesis, and we're going to uphold his decision. At the time, the rules of federal Supreme Court allowed that when the state interprets the federal Constitution, you're entitled to a direct appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so we then appealed that directly to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's how Baker versus Nelson actually got there. And the court did not deny our claim. The court just simply dismissed the claim. It's a very important distinction. And so basically the ruling of the Minnesota Supreme Court was left intact with no opinion rendered by the Minnesota Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court, that remained in effect for the next 40 years. And basically what the U.S. Supreme Court was saying is that now is not the time to answer this question. We will do it at some point in the future. I didn't expect that it would take some 40-some years to do it, answer the question, but they did do it in 2015, and they answered the very question that we had posed: do gay citizens of the United States have a constitutional right to marry? And the answer was, to me, a second-year law student, to me it was intuitively obvious. Well, of course, that coincided with everything that we had learned, that I had been taught in my first year of law school. So at the time when the district court decided to not overturn the decision of the clerk of court, we knew that this was going to take some time, and so we decided that the next best alternative to marriage, it's not quite the same, but the next best alternative to get some of the benefits would be to do an adoption. And that way you get at least inheritance rights, the right of inheritance, and a few other rights, which I don't need to go into. And so we decided that we would go ahead and we would do an adoption and have Mike adopt me. And even the statute at the time did not permit adults to marry, one adult to marry another adult. And that was one of the questions that was raised by the judge, and the judge who issued the writ, the order, the adoption order, felt the need to write an opinion that this may sound strange, but there's nothing in the state statute that forbids two adults to marry to adopt each other. And so we went through that process, and during that process, my attorney said that, are you aware that you can change in an adoption proceedings, you can change the name of the child? I did not know that, being a law student, and this was not part of the plan, but since the attorney pointed it out, I said, well, certainly, let's go ahead and change the name. And that's when we decided that we would go ahead and change my name to Pat Lynn McConnell, and to match it up with Mike's name and his family, and so we had asked the judge to include that in the order, and that was included in the order, and so there was a legal name change approved by a court, and we were entitled under the statute to have a license because the statute said you could have it. It was not forbidden by law, and so we just decided that we would go down to another county, 60 miles south, Blue Earth County, and set up residency according to statute, and then apply for that license, and that's what we did. Mike went in, applied. The clerk of court then waited the 7-day limit, I believe it is, whatever the limit is, to do due diligence, and the assumption was that the clerk of court did the due diligence, and the clerk of court then issued a license under the seal of the court. And so it was a very lawfully issued and a legal license that was issued. And then we, as Mike pointed out, we had the Reverend Roger Lynn validate the license in a valid ceremony. And so that's why we went through that, that's why we became the first legally recognized marriage in this country. The clerk, we did not know that the clerk then, after all the paperwork was filed back with the clerk of court in Blue Earth County, we did not know for about 40 years that the clerk just simply refused to record the license. We assumed that we went through the steps, we got the license, we returned the paperwork, and the statute said that the clerk is under an obligation to record the marriage records, and that a failure to record a marriage record is a $10 fine. And so we just assumed that the clerk would record the documents. The clerk would just refuse to record it after that. And we've only recently learned that that paperwork has not been recorded, and so we're in the process now of rectifying that, and that's a case that's a work in progress, and that may actually be another case that ends up in federal court. We hope not, but it may, and so this is still not over. We followed all the rules of the court and under the rules of the statute, and we went through that. We've waited 40 years and had the U.S. Supreme Court agree that we were correct. Everything we did was correct and legally, and it was our constitutional right to get the license in the first place. It was legally issued, but it still remains unrecorded. And so it's one of those things that if you don't stand up and defend yourself, no one else will either. And so we're in the process of just simply continuing that process. It seems to be never ending, but we're not going to give up until we have everything set and done the way it is we're entitled to according to law. Okay.
As you may have determined, we're pretty persistent people. We don't give up easily, especially concerning our rights. I took to heart what my parents taught me as a young man, that you are as good as anyone else, and I believe the Constitution when it says we're all equal. And one of the things that often got us into trouble in our gay activist years was that we refused to take less than full equality. When people were negotiating for various rights, whatever the bullies in power decided they were willing to give you at the time, was not good enough for us. We absolutely would refuse anything less than the same equality that all other citizens had. So we have always stood for that, and that got us into some trouble over the years. But as you can see, we've discovered now, very late in our life, that clerk refused to do what the law required the clerk to do. So we will address that issue. We have our own law firm to deal with these folks, and as Social Security and other government agencies deal with our request and our valid certificate of marriage, we will make sure that all the T's are crossed, the I's are dotted. So this year we celebrated the 49th anniversary of our commitment to one another. That was in 1967 when we committed. And we celebrated our 45th year of legal marriage on September 3rd of 2016, just last month. All this history, our history, is now a personal history that has included over 50 years of materials collected over the years, now over 70,000 pages of documents and letters and other instruments, over 400 photos, videos, and other multimedia productions, as well as countless artifacts. These document our marriage equality fight and our fight for the full civil rights for GLBTQ people, and endless other issues of concern to all of us, making sure young kids who are growing up are supported and loved, and that older adults have a safe and welcoming retirement. The Tretter Collection in GLBT Studies at the University of Minnesota houses our collection of personal documents. That collection is now over 10 million pages of documents in 50 languages. It's an amazing array of artifacts and items that document Minnesota and upper Midwest U.S. history, which most people know little to nothing about. Believe it or not, Minnesota was a hotbed in the heart of the country when the early gay rights movement took on its most militant behaviors in the late 60s and early 70s. That history is now documented in the collections at the Tretter. So why, after 45 years, did we decide to write our memoir? Why not, if we had all this stuff and knew this 45 years ago, why didn't we write the history sooner than this year for release? Well, with the push for marriage equality in more recent years, histories that left out the true beginning of the fight for marriage equality were being written. We felt it was now time to tell the true, complete story of where it all began. Our vision, legal marriage for same-sex couples, guided the gay agenda, sometimes hidden in the background, for 44 years. Nonetheless, it was an issue during at least 4 presidential campaigns and still continues to be a huge national issue. Our vision has impacted other countries as well. This concept has generated powerful thought currents that continue to sweep and transform the planet. In our lifetime, we've witnessed same-sex marriage become a reality in country after country. That transformation of this world into a fairer, kinder place continues to this day. We watch with pleasure as kindred spirits around the globe at last acknowledged what we have always known ourselves. Love is the strongest force in the universe. The commitment of 2 people to care for each other is a beautiful, valuable part of being human. It's a fundamental right of all people. We simply wanted to tell that story in our own words as supported by the historical record. Now, to close out here, I just want to read something from the last chapter of the book. Nearly 43 years to the day after Jack and I applied for our marriage license in Hennepin County, justice prevailed. Our state, Minnesota, became the 12th state to legalize marriage for all lovers on May 13th, 2013. I was there to witness the historic vote in the state Senate. That was almost to the day that we applied for a marriage license on May 18, 1970. Looking back, I'm proud that Jack and I were the first. But when we were married, gay marriage was a revolutionary idea. Today, marriage equality seems like the most reasonable of notions. Of course, gay men and women deserve the right to marry, legally, officially, in front of our families and friends, officials and ministers. Of course, because it's our country. And yes, in the down-home words of Mother McConnell, we're all as good as anybody else. A final reminder. We cannot forget that the fight for GLBT rights is far from over. Recent hate and violence directed at us tells us we must remain strong and resolute. We must never forget, love is the most powerful force in the universe. Hate will never win over love. Now, we'd like to open it up for questions. So if you have questions, 2 microphones, please ask questions. Believe me, over 45 years, there isn't a question you can ask that will embarrass us. Yes.
I just want to personally thank you for your leadership. I myself has been a gay activist since the early 1970s. In fact, in 1975, Frank Kameny and I, among others, testified before the D.C. City Council on behalf of a bill that would have legalized same-sex marriage in the District of Columbia. So I just wanted to, out of personal curiosity, did you all have any interaction with Frank Kameny, the man who basically invented political gay activism and because he was fired from the civil service in the 1950s for being gay, and he lost his case before the Supreme Court as well. Just wondering if you had any interactions with him. And I'm also curious if you have any interactions with another good friend of mine, a giant in gay history, Stephen Dean, who came from Minnesota and came to Washington in the 70s as the first director of what's now the Human Rights Campaign. So did you have any stories to share about either Frank Kameny or Stephen Dean?
Yeah, absolutely.
First, Frank Kameny, yes. Frank was the one who set up the arranged to have an attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union to do get against the Air Force to reinstate my
Honorable discharge.
Honorable discharge.
Yeah, we knew Frank for many years, quite frankly. I have a lot of correspondence in our papers with Frank. We first met him in 1968 in Kansas City when the North American Homophile Conference was held. And that was where we met him, and Jack connected with him about taking on the Air Force over his honorable discharge. And over the years, we corresponded with him and worked with him on many issues. When the American Psychiatric Association was under assault for its, shall we say, antediluvian belief about gays as mentally ill, Jack worked with him and Barbara Giddings and others on those issues and testified. And then one year when Jack was student body president, student body presidents from across the US were here in DC for a meeting, and we were in DC, and I actually stayed at Frank's home during that time and spent a little time with him. But over the years, we interacted with Frank a great deal. So we knew him and admired him tremendously and appreciated the work that he did at the same time we were working. Stephen Dean, I knew quite well. Steve came to one of the first free meetings, which was the campus group that Jack was president of. And at the time, he was closeted and was a driver for Wendell Anderson, who was running for governor of the state of Minnesota and who was eventually elected. Ultimately, he was elected, quite frankly, because we organized as gay people in the DFL, the Democratic Party in Minnesota, and got a lot of vote out, and they took over not only the governor's office, but the Senate and the legislature for the first time in a very long time. But I spent many hours talking with Steve about gay liberation, and he he formed, like many others in Minneapolis at the time, he worked with others out of Gay House, which was one of the first gay community centers in the country, to start forming gay political organizations. Minnesota Committee for Gay and Lesbian Rights was one of those groups that Steve formed and worked on issues for a number of years in Minnesota. As Minnesota passed rights and protected gay people, Steve decided to leave Minnesota and move to Washington, D.C., where he began HRC. And the story goes on from there. We were always very troubled, and as I said, we got into a lot of trouble when we stood for full and absolute equality, no exceptions, no excuses. Because when it came to gay civil rights, we believed that we had to be treated exactly the same. And when Steve was working with MCGLR, that group was negotiating with people in the legislature and seemed ready to negotiate for less than full rights. That didn't set well with us, and so we created quite a stink. So let me just say that in the community, in the city, there were now warring camps. Our view of full and absolute equality, and others who were willing to take what they could get or go slow, we were not willing to do that. So eventually, though, Steve did move to DC, as I said, and formed HRC, and that has become one of the if not the leading national organization. Yes.
Hi, you quoted a number of the letters, and obviously the ones that were in support were inspiring, reaffirming. But I presume the overwhelming majority of letters you actually got were probably anti-gay people reacting. Really?
Surprisingly, no.
No.
Surprisingly, I would say out of the thousands, literally thousands of letters from all around the planet, maybe 50 were negative.
Wow.
And most of them were totally irrational, like, you faggot rats, you should be in hell. Most of them were that kind of thing. A few had reasoned discourse, but otherwise, no. They were overwhelmingly positive, and most of them were from many young gay people who were just so thrilled to see finally someone who could represent how they truly felt. A couple who was willing to stand for the kinds of things that they believed.
Right, most of the questions were from, as Mike points out, young adults who were asking basically the question, how do I find Mr. or Miss Right? And that's why the book is aimed at young adults. And it's not aimed at our peers. It's aimed at the lower audience, and it addresses that, tries to address that question of how do I find Mr. or Miss Right?
Do you think the response would have been different in this day of the internet, where every wacko feels inclined to send off an email? Do you think you would have gotten a more...
Honestly, I don't think the wackos were shy in those days, because when we gave lectures, and we talked face-to-face to 500,000 people in Minnesota, giving lectures all around the state, and then in Canada and across the country. And what we found consistently was that a number, and in some cases we were doing surveys, tell us what you thought of the lecture and what questions you had, or what could we improve, that sort of thing. It was literally everywhere we went, however small the town, we lectured in towns of 500 people, for example. When those came back, 90%, literally 90% said, interesting, I just had questions, just wanted to know, good for you guys. 10% would say, can't buy this on any level, sorry, my religion forbids it. That was the response we got most. And most of the hate stuff that came to us was really based on religion. It was always cited religious sources for their hate.
Next question.
Hi, thanks very much for sharing the story. I'm a journalist, and I'm writing an article at the minute about the history of gay bars.
Okay, speaking to the mic.
Sorry, is that better?
Yes.
Is that better? I'm writing an article at the moment about the history of gay bars around the world and the role that they've played
Yes.
for gay people. One of the roles that they've played in certain cities and certain countries is that they have been places where activists have met, and obviously there have also been places where people have fallen in love as well. And I just wondered whether bars have played any role in your story, either as places where you gave talks or places where you socialise with people, whether bars and gay pubs at all in anywhere have come into the story.
Well, yes, bars certainly played a role. I mean, you know, people talk about black churches as the place of gathering for communities and awareness. The same is true, I think, even today for certain parts of the community. A very important part of that social kind of connectedness and the exchange of ideas. It was true in our time as well, perhaps even more so than before the time, for example, when I worked with John Preston to form Gay House, which was a gay community center, which there became other focal points in communities where people could go who were not oriented toward bars or alcohol was an issue or any other number of things. But yes, and even today, I'm thinking of a bar in Minneapolis that is really activist still today. They often have people in, and they have a pretty in-your-face kind of attitude about presenting gay life in a positive way. It's called Lush, which is really very neat place. And people go and, you know, they have Taco Tuesdays, and you meet, and you go and you see political people, and you see people from the faith community and all of that. So yes, bars play a part, and I think still do, but there are many other options for those who don't want to partake of that. In Minneapolis, we have a public, privately nonprofit organization called Quatrefoil Library. It is a circulating library of gay history and materials that you can just check out, just like a public library. That's supported by donations and by volunteers, and it's now celebrating its 30th year. So there are many other things that people can use as connections in the community. Okay, I think we are kind of at the end of our time. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you. If you are interested, Jack and I have our trusty little pins, and we're happy to autograph copies of our book for you if you'd like to do that.